Hi, welcome to the webinar from the O'Neill Institute for National and Global Health Law at Georgetown University Law Center, and also Georgetown University is co-hosting this. We've got a very special panel, and I'm very privileged to be moderating it. My name is Larry Gostin. I'm professor of global health law at Georgetown and the director of the O'Neill Institute and director of the World Health Organization Collaborating Center on National and Global Health Law. And I'm going to be joined by Senator Van Hollen, Beth Cameron, and James Palmer. And I'm going to first introduce Senator Van Hollen, who unfortunately can't stay with us throughout, but he'll give us some initial remarks. I'll ask him a few questions, and then we'll get into a moderated discussion with Beth and James, and I'll be introducing them. Before we got on camera, I was telling Senator Van Hollen that I hosted one of his first, if not his first, fundraiser when he was running for Congress in my district. I loved what he said then. He was fantastic, and he's captured me all the way to the Senate and well beyond. I regard him as, one of the most influential senators and the most thoughtful of all senators. I may be biased, but I don't think so. He's really terrific. He's a senator from Maryland. He's on a number of committees, but I'll just mention the Senate Committee on Appropriations, and he's one of those people that needs no introduction. He's just been on the national stage. And so, Senator, may I turn it over to you, and then I'll ask you just a few questions before you have to hop off.
Well, sure. And thank you, Professor Gostin. Thank you for your very warm words. Thank you for hosting that early event. And it seems to have worked. Most of all, thank you for the really great work that you're doing and the O'Neill Institute is doing. I'm a proud graduate of the Georgetown Law Center and grateful for all that you are doing at the center. And it's great to be on with our other panelists as well. And I apologize for not being able to stay, but I just appreciate the opportunity to say a few words on this subject. And Larry, do you want me to just make a few remarks now and then answer your questions, or
that would be lovely, Senator. Thank you very much.
Let me just start with let me start somewhat narrowly focused and then go a little broader. Let me start with the WHO, which Professor you obviously have a very strong affiliation with. And look, I think we all recognize that the World Health Organization is not a perfect institution. Few institutions are. But it's an absolutely necessary institution. And if we didn't have it, we would want to create it because it's a recognition of what we all know, which is that diseases know no borders. And that's, of course, increasingly so as we can travel around the world at short notice. And of course, this COVID-19 pandemic is the case in point as to why we want a World Health Organization to begin with. And it's essential the United States play a leadership role in that organization because it serves as part of our overall early warning system as well as part of our overall response system. So look, the Trump administration's announcement that it was going to withdraw from the WHO, in my view, was a purely political reaction to the criticism the president was getting here at home for his inadequate response. And I strongly believe it was completely inadequate, that the United States got caught at least 6 to 8 weeks behind what we should have known and responded to in terms of testing and ramping up and taking other actions. And so as the COVID-19 virus spread, and as we have the unfortunate and dubious distinction now of seeing, being the world's leader in terms of deaths from COVID-19, the White House needed to find scapegoats, and one of them was the WHO. Now, there has been a bipartisan sort of pushback on that. Democrats pushing back, vocally. Some Republican senators and others pushing back more quietly, but still urging the administration to reverse its decision. And of course, the administration, despite making the announcement, has fortunately not taken any action, at least so far. And I think, that was a recognition that our withdrawal from that institution would be damaging in the long run, but let's see where we go from here. Now, of course, the other entity, that the president pointed his fingers at here was China. And, China, of course, is far from blameless in terms of allowing others to know in a timely manner about the spread of the virus. But nevertheless, the reality is that given when we learned about it and what we knew about it, we were still caught very flat-footed and did not respond adequately. And so in addition to the WHO, the president, of course, has lashed out at China. And that, in my view, again, is part of the politics. And of course, the irony here is, from a global perspective, the one, big winner politically from us withdrawing from the WHO would, of course, be China, which the president claims that he wants to hold responsible. And at the same time, they've already committed to more money and resources to WHO. So it obviously is a little shooting ourselves in the foot with respect to the WHO. Let me just close a little more broadly with respect to China. I'm not one of those who's itching for a Cold War with China. That said, I think there's a broad bipartisan recognition on Capitol Hill that China is our number one sort of strategic challenge. That's been true for a very long time and will become increasingly true going forward, and that we do need to confront China on a number of fronts. And I've been part of bipartisan legislation to do that. Everything from the theft of U.S. technology and intellectual property, and things with Huawei and ZTE, where my view is we need to be working cooperatively with our European allies in the EU to make sure that Huawei doesn't wire a good part of the world for national security reasons. And I have also believed that we need to continue to stand up for human rights, and when China is violating its commitments with respect to Hong Kong, we need to take a very strong stand. That's also true with the human rights violations against the Uyghurs and others. And so all that said, there are obviously areas where we would gain from cooperation with China. Obviously, fighting pandemics is one example. Dealing with climate change is another. Now, it seems, and when we scheduled this, it was before the early chapters of John Bolton's book came to light. But the assessment he gives in this book, and look, I'm one of those who said John Bolton, he should have told us about this much earlier. He had a responsibility to the country. But at least with respect to China, I'm not surprised. And his bottom line is that, in fact, far from being a tough guy in private, President Trump has really tried to cozy up to President Xi to get what President Trump wants on the issues of selling soybeans and trade agreements. But President Trump has been very quick to retreat on questions like Huawei and ZTE, and has barely raised any noise at all when it comes to things like Hong Kong, and certainly not done anything to date. And with the Uyghurs, apparently agreed with Xi as to what they were doing. So it does seem that the president's strategy with China was let's ignore some of the big strategic issues. Let's ignore the human rights issues. And maybe if we do that, President Xi will buy more soybeans from American farmers. In my view, that is a terrible way to approach foreign policy. Not that we don't have trade issues, we do, but we shouldn't be trading off the national security issues for more soybean purchases. Again, I'll sort of wrap it up with the WHO. I think what happened is as the administration's response to COVID-19 became so obviously inadequate, the president, said he's got an election coming up, and he went full bore in pointing fingers at China, and that's where we are today. And it's a very unfortunate situation, because we do need to challenge China on the right things where we should be challenging them, and not picking unnecessary fights when we should be cooperating in certain areas. So let me end there, Larry, and happy to try and answer any questions.
Thank you very much. It's hard for me as a moderator because I just happen to agree with everything you just said. But I wanted to just ask you really two basic questions, and then we can ask others if you've got time, but not necessarily. You covered both the global and the national. On the global side, I'm not trying to be party political, but President Obama, in fact, Beth Cameron was very central to that in the National Security Council in the Obama administration, really did try to lead on global health, the global health security agenda, the Ebola appropriation, the Zika appropriation. So, given where we are with COVID in the world, and it's, with any luck, will be going down, although not yet. And it will be in sub-Saharan Africa, Latin America, the Indian subcontinent, the Middle East. How could, the United States be a global health leader in relation to COVID? I mean, what kind of steps could we take to establish? Because I think the world is really missing and actually aching over the absence of the United States leadership here.
Well, I think that's exactly right. We've abandoned what has been, our historic, willingness to stand up at moments like this of global crisis and help lead the way. And yeah, I want to thank Beth for her efforts as well. And if you look at the earlier responses that we made, for example, the Ebola response, where we, deployed, people and assets to the front lines and help address that issue. It was a perfect example of how we were helping the world, and we were helping ourselves in stopping the spread. And that's the nature of these diseases. With our leadership, we are protecting the American people, and we are also protecting others around the world. And that's what this administration doesn't seem to get or understand or want to. In the earlier CARES Act that was passed by Congress, we did provide around $2 billion for the United States to help support efforts around the world to respond to COVID-19. But number one, that's simply inadequate in terms of resources. And second, we didn't have the leadership through the executive branch to help make sure that we were on the front lines there. And as you know, when it comes to the issue of looking for a vaccine, we sort of put up our own walls and said that we're gonna do our thing. I know scientists are still working together and sharing information as they should, but I think we really need to be doing pretty much everything that we're not, which is convening groups and organizations and countries virtually, and then deploying the resources where they're necessary. Because as you just indicated, the pandemic is growing in many parts of the world, just as it seems to be growing in 20 of our states right now. And unfortunately, we're at this moment in our country where instead of following the advice of experts, the health experts, we have the president undermining those both through his actions and his words. I mean, we got this big this big conference out in, Tulsa, Oklahoma coming up in a closed stadium. The CDC they now seem to issue their guidelines Friday night, as far as I can tell, without much fanfare. So it is hard to be the global leader when you're putting politics over science and health policy. So it really needs to start at the top. Now, I will say that we are going to try on a bipartisan basis, I hope, to provide more resources to our international efforts. But at the end of the day, as you know, in our system of government, that requires the executive branch to execute it.
Yeah, I mean, just a quick follow-up. I have so many questions I'd love to ask you in terms of, say, could we go to the UN Security Council the way that President Obama did with Ebola and many other areas. But you mentioned vaccines, and I think that's on everybody's mind at the moment. So why don't we maybe end there? There's probably been no health commodity as important in my lifetime as a vaccine for COVID-19 for health reasons, economic and other reasons. But there seems to be a race between the United States, China, Europe, Russia's in it. India has a very strong pharmaceutical industry as well. Do you worry about a global competition concerning vaccines, and also, is there anything that we could do as a country or as an international community to promote equitable distribution of vaccines when they come? Does all that worry you?
All this does worry me. So I'm fine with there being, competition to develop a good workable vaccine, so long as at the end of the day, that competition doesn't result in an ability for, one company or one country just to hoard the fruits of that research. I think here in the United States, we have at least 6 or 7 ongoing, sort of active trials and efforts with respect to a vaccine. And of course, there are others around the world. Now, and this goes back to the WHO, when you're dealing with a pandemic, really, we should be sharing information to figure out, which is the best and most effective vaccine, because, again, I don't mind the competition to find the best, most effective one is fine. But once you're there, that's when it's very important that it become universally available and available without any kind of price gouging. And we were very focused early on in the Congress at making sure that the testing would be available to everybody at no cost, because it's obviously the interest of someone who's got it, COVID-19, to get the test, and it's obviously in the interest of the entire community that they get the test and find out whether they've got it or not. And the same is true of a vaccine. It's obviously in everybody's interest that everybody have access to the vaccine. Now, I hope that as the vaccine comes online, if it's not, all available at once, and I do believe that they're going to be ramping up production ahead of times in multiple lines of the vaccine.
Yeah.
That's an investment that I think is worth making, so that even if one doesn't work, if the other one does, you've got ample production. But it's going to be essential, Professor, as you say, to make sure that those most in need, not just those with the most money, are able to access the first vaccines as they become more widely available. So the most vulnerable in terms of contracting COVID-19, plus of course our frontline workers, our healthcare workers, and then others who are on the front lines of this pandemic and more at risk. And it's essential that this be covered, that there not be a cost, so that people aren't discouraged from getting it because they can't afford it. And then of course the broader question around the world. I think we really need a consortium of countries that will come together once we have an idea which of these is working best to distribute this globally.
Yeah, I mean, I think you've really encapsulated a lot of this. United States leadership does mean leading our allies and others to try to deal with a collective approach to COVID-19, including vaccines. You also need a World Health Organization that's able to do that and gets the kind of political support and funding that it needs. But we seem to be so far away from that ideal. I'm just so grateful that there are wise voices in the Congress like you, Senator Van Hollen, and I realize that I've kept you longer than I even promised that I would. I'm enormously grateful to you for joining us. And if I may, I would love to reach out to you and serve you in any way that we can to try to make this happen.
Well, please do. I look forward to working with you, and I really appreciate your leadership and the Institute's leadership here. And it's good to join with everyone listening. And I want to thank our other panelists here for their expertise, and thank you for allowing me to say a few words and answer a few questions at the outset. I apologize for having to jump off.
Not at all. Thank you very much, Senator, and we'll be in touch very soon. We actually have a letter to Congress about the WHO that I'll share with you.
Okay, we'll be in touch for sure.
Okay, good, great.
All right.
Thanks. Take care.
Bye-bye.
Bye. So we're going to continue our conversation with James Palmer and Beth Cameron. I'm going to introduce each of them. Then James is just going to say, a minute or two, some comments. Beth will do the same. And then most of the rest of this will be a moderated panel where I'll just be asking questions and answers. And if you in the audience would like to ask some questions, and I encourage you to do it, just use the question and answer function on the Zoom call, please. First, James Palmer is going to speak. He's the senior editor of Foreign Policy magazine. He writes largely on China's foreign policy and the role in international affairs. He's the author of many books, particularly on China and looking at its role in the world. And China has been a fast rising player in geopolitical and now health politics around the world. Beth Cameron, who I've known for quite some time, and dear friend, is the Nuclear Threat Initiative's Vice President for Global Biological Policy and Programs. As mentioned earlier, she was the Senior Director of Global Health Security and Biodefense in the White House National Security Council staff under President Obama. And she was instrumental in many of the global health initiatives of the time, but most notably the Global Health Security Agenda, which I regard as the high watermark of American leadership in global health. So with that, James, would you take a few minutes, then I'll ask Beth to do it, and then I'll moderate a conversation.
Thank you so much, Larry. That was great. And thank you also to the Senator for his remarks. I think, what we're seeing at the moment is a kind of double crisis, because we're seeing a crisis of leadership not only on the part of the United States, which has previously played this critical role in global health, which has been undermined by the Trump administration as a whole, and specifically by the recent decisions and the complete farce over the handling of the coronavirus. But we're also seeing a crisis on the Chinese side, because the Chinese side has long sought to portray itself as a reliable actor, as a steady part of the global order, as a power that can step up in the world. But because of the domestic tumult in China over the last few years, and particularly the level of massively increased nationalist political paranoia, the sense of the world being against China that's epitomized Xi Jinping's regime, a lot of that has been undermined and a lot of that has been destroyed. And we saw some of the consequences of that in the early days of this outbreak, when those kind of domestic political paranoias that we had hoped had been overcome during SARS instead re-emerged, and we saw this pattern again of cover-ups, of threats, and so on. And with something like the WHO, it puts international organizations in a very painful position, because I think lots of people pointed to Chinese funding as being the reason why the WHO maybe didn't speak up as much as it could have on Chinese failings. But that was really inaccurate because, as you know, China is a relatively small funder compared to the United States. It's much more about access and about the access that these groups, these international groups, need in order to be able to fulfill their role. And China is very conscious of that. So whereas the United States, barring this sort of temper tantrum by Trump aside, the United States is not going to cut off access to America by WHO officials or by medical staff, or prevent its medical staff from talking to global organizations, or be able to restrict its people from reliably reporting information. China can put those kind of complete blocks in. And so organizations like the UN, like the WHO, find themselves in this position where they have effectively to pander to China and to go along with these kind of political restraints, such as the necessity to sort of heap praise on Xi Jinping, to praise the Chinese system, all this kind of thing that we saw repeatedly in the early days of the outbreak, and that caused a lot of embarrassment for Tedros and for the WHO. In order to try and get this access that they need. And as anybody who's dealt with them privately knows, there's many complaints about this by WHO staff personally, but the institution feels the need to do this kind of political performance. Now, in the long run, I think that really undermines the role of these international organizations, and there needs to be a better way to try and cope with Chinese recalcitrance without doing these kind of performances towards Beijing. But it's also, I think, undercut Beijing's claims as China has started to insist more and more on this kind of obsequience. It's undercut China's authority to start stepping in as a responsible power.
Thank you. I mean, we'll get into this much more, but of course, President Trump praised China around the same time that Dr. Tedros did. And there have been reports that have come out quite reliable that while WHO was perhaps not publicly criticizing China for good reason, perhaps, it was pushing very hard behind the scenes diplomatically. So let me turn it over to Beth, and then I'll moderate the discussion. We can get more into that, into the WHO and China as we go forward.
Thanks so much, Larry. It's always a pleasure to be with you and the O'Neill Institute and James, and also thanking Senator Van Hollen for his excellent remarks. I'll be relatively brief because I definitely want to get into the Q&A and also have time for the audience. But, you know, James makes a lot of great points about the lack of information that we have anytime in a pandemic, but particularly in this pandemic in December and early January. And I think there's also another critical issue at play here between health and security, which is that for really, you know, for far too long, we've treated pandemic threats as global health challenges. And we've put a lot of pressure on the World Health Organization to moderate those challenges, which really at the end of the day are about not just global health, but about peace and security, the international economy. And so we've put WHO in the middle of really moderating what is at the end of the day a security issue between, in this case, the United States and China throwing rocks at each other. And I guess what I want to focus on for just a quick minute is, you know, what would we have wanted to see, and maybe how could we have been in a different situation, even given the facts of this particular pandemic. I think that a couple of things could have happened differently in early January. I think first, you know, the fact that the United States did not actually work with the UN Security Council or try to work more directly with China, and I certainly wasn't in the administration for this response, but we have evidence that the Secretary of Health and Human Services reached out to China, but we don't have a lot of evidence about what the president actually did in his remarks with President Xi directly, or what kind of diplomacy was happening. it's absolutely vital. I hope that this is what happened, but I have no evidence that it did, that we were working behind the scenes with China to get more information. To say that only the WHO was the conduit to have information about what was, by all accounts, in early January, an emerging novel pandemic pathogen, it's just hard to believe that we weren't focused on getting more information ourselves, working with our other partners in Southeast Asia, working with our other partners around the world, and working collaboratively with the WHO. So the first point is, this is a national security issue. Our National Security Council and our White House should have been working it the way that we work other national security challenges, which isn't to sit back on our heels and say, the WHO or whatever other UN organization isn't exactly able to get the information we want. I guess we just won't get that information. Of course, we're going to go out and we're going to conduct diplomacy. We're going to make calls to the president. We're going to get more information. But second, it also really shows the value that we should have been putting on our science diplomacy, our public health diplomacy. We know that we've had a longstanding relationship between the United States CDC and the China CDC. And we definitely, under this administration, have cut down the number of personnel that were working together. And for whatever reasons that may have been, and I don't know all of them, I think it definitely hurt us in terms of our information flow and our ability to work together. If you look back at 2016, a period of time in the administration transition between President Obama and President Trump, the H7N9 flu virus, which has not become sustainably transmitted between humans, but which is a pathogen with high mortality in humans, there was an increase in cases at that time. And there's a lot of literature that shows and is co-published between the US CDC and China CDC about whether it was sustainably transmitted. So it's kind of a case study, if you look back at that time frame, about what should have been happening. Collaborative work on the ground, collaborative diplomatic discussions, work in the White House to talk about what would happen if this became sustainably transmitted. And it's just really unclear that in those few weeks at the beginning of January that that's what was happening. So to bring it back to WHO, Larry, and then I'll stop and let you ask questions. I think blaming this on the organization caught in the middle is not only unfair, it's super counterproductive. We need the WHO to be strong, but we also need to help the WHO through our own diplomacy and our own cooperation with a key partner like China, where I agree with the senator, we don't always agree. We have major national security challenges with China, but on public health and global health security, we have to work together, and we have to be much more closely, we have to have much closer collaboration to get to the information sharing that we need to save the 100,000 lives that we've lost.
Yeah, so that's fantastic, Beth and James. I mean, really, you're kind of pulling it all together. You know, why was the US sitting back? Why wasn't it using its smart diplomacy with allies in other countries to try to get to the bottom of this? And then also the importance of information and how we can verify this information. WHO, we have to remember, doesn't have the power to just go into a country. A sovereign country can say no, and China did limit WHO's access early on. And so you've got this issue with China where you've got, on the one hand, we saw a jaw-dropping display about China, building a 1,000-bed hospital in a week, locking down 60 million people very, very quickly. But on the other hand, its lack of transparency and its, and its chilling of civil society and whistleblowers held us back. So with all that, where do we go with this? I mean, let me just begin with twofold. First, how can we empower the World Health Organization to be the organization that really can lead, to give it the political support and funding? And then secondly, what's gone wrong in America, or right, if you think so, and how can we shift that? So either one of you can jump in right away. James, do you want to try it on China?
Sure. So I think, just thinking of this point as the WHO as a leader, I think there's some degree to which that isn't really possible. I don't think we're in a time when international organizations can lead, because these kind of divisions and the level of separation between the US and China is becoming so acute. And in many ways, we're only at the first stage of that. And so we have to think about what kind of roles they can do and do very well, which is sometimes to facilitate, to step in and try and be these sort of bridges, but ultimately I think the responsibility comes down to the countries involved themselves. And of course, as you said before, putting this burden, and Beth said, putting this burden on the WHO is often unfair to them because they're stuck in the middle in these things. So, and in the next few years, we're going to be looking at China that's even fiercer in its opposition to the US, and quite possibly a US bipartisan consensus that's even more sort of opposed or sees China as an opponent even more. And so I think we have to be going, and everybody always hates it when we talk about the new Cold War, this kind of thing, and there are tons of problems with that term. But we have to start looking, I think, perhaps back at some of the models of successful cooperation between the US and the Soviet Union, because the US and the Soviet Union did cooperate very successfully on a number of issues, on arms reduction, to some degree on the environment, even a little bit on human rights and international law. And so I think going back and looking at that experience, looking at how do these international organizations position themselves between two hostile powers, or powers that see the other as a strategic opponent, is going to be something that we have to think long and hard about. I just want to know, I think on the American side, I think one of the real lessons of this has been just how quickly institutional expertise and skill can disappear when it's under attack. Because I think all of us were expecting these kind of diplomacy, this kind of efforts. We're expecting the CDC to do more. We're expecting all of this. We're expecting plans to be in place as the pandemic started to be an obvious threat, and none of that was there. All these institutions had been so rotted or crumbled that even the very many good people inside them were not able to act and to function effectively. And on the international level, that applies even more. When you lose those connections and you lose that expertise, those kind of memories and that ability to act can go so fast.
Yeah. So we've talked a lot about WHO and China. So let me just ask a kind of a blue sky question. I mean, from Beth's perspective, we need to do more to support the WHO and to make it the kind of leader that the world needs. From James's perspective, an international institution, most of them, including WHO, in the modern world don't have that capability. So talk a little bit about, in Beth's view, what could we imagine for WHO? And for James's perspective, if not WHO, then who or what?
I'm happy to take a first crack at that. And sorry, James, because some of what I might say might be about how we can work outside the WHO to help WHO, but I'll try not to say only those things. So first, Larry, I think we do need to support the WHO. So that means obviously funding it. And why do we need to support the WHO? The WHO organizes clinical trials on vaccines for the world. The WHO has offices all over the world that allow our programs, our US programs, to be legitimate in those countries. And of course, the WHO does a lot of work to provide global health services, personal protective equipment in the case of COVID-19, all of these reasons. So it may go without saying, but because it's a large audience, I want to explain why do we need the WHO? Why does it need to be strong? But I think we also have to provide for institutions that can help the WHO be even stronger. And so, for example, the Global Preparedness Monitoring Board is an organization that the WHO and the World Bank stood up to be an independent oversight board. And it's been moderately effective. I think it could have been stronger. It could have been used more effectively in the crisis of COVID-19. It's co-chaired by two really strong and smart individuals, Gro Brundtland, the former Prime Minister of Norway and former WHO Director General, and Az Si, who used to head the International Federation of Red Cross and Red Crescent Societies and now oversees the Kofi Annan Foundation. So it has all the right ingredients, but it hasn't been really embraced, I don't think, by WHO as an oversight entity. And I think WHO would be well served to give up a little bit more power in oversight to an organization like that could have some political clout in emergencies like this one. So that's one thing, giving up some of its power towards accountability from an external body like the Global Preparedness Monitoring Board. I also think that the UN Secretary General should put in place a permanent leader somewhere in the UN, in New York, focused on high consequence biological events for two reasons. One, I think that the UN would be well served by having a permanent person responsible for tabletop exercises regularly with global leaders that was looking at this from a health and a security point of view. I think that would be helpful to WHO. And I don't think that WHO has embraced that idea yet, but I think it would be really helpful to them if they did. I also think that person could be very helpful in making appeals for finances and funding, not just in this situation, but for the future to build pandemic preparedness. And then last, I think that countries like the United States could do more on global currently, could do more with our own bilateral and multilateral cooperation, and specifically getting back to China. We had a successful bilateral cooperation with China on science, economics, and other matters to include global health and global health security, where we were talking about global health and pandemic preparedness between experts at NIH and CDC. That kind of cooperation is invaluable, and I don't think that it was going on when COVID-19 emerged, and that's unfortunate. That was another avenue for us to get information earlier that we absolutely needed, that China did not share as early as it should have.
Thanks, Beth. James, do you want to jump in here?
Well, Beth's expertise on this is much greater than mine in terms of international organizations and corporations. There's just 2 points I wanted to pick up on. One is bilateral cooperation. I think one of the really important things that we can be doing there is shared exercises, scenarios, role playing, this kind of thing. That has two purposes. It's not really so much about gaming out the scenario itself as it is about familiarizing each side with the way that the other side thinks about and prepares for and works in these situations. And that kind of experience of seeing how Chinese officials behave, and for Chinese officials who are often quite unknowing of the way that the United States itself actually works, be it for them to see how their American counterparts respond and what they prioritize and so on. I think that's really important. We've already done that in things like nuclear disasters. There's been several exercises concentrating on where US and Chinese participants have worked together to simulate a nuclear disaster and the response. But even, one of the fun things in those even has been occasionally they've had the Chinese side taking the US role and vice versa to try and get a better understanding of the limitations that each one functions under, both politically and systematically. And then the other thing I'd say that could be done is to start tying some of the health organizations much more tightly in with global travel, because one of the things we really saw in this pandemic was this real debate over when should borders be closed, when should flights be stopped. At one point, China closing down flights to some areas while putting pressure on countries like Pakistan to still accept Chinese travelers. And I think tying some of those global aviation organizations in more tightly with pandemic response and establishing norms about when borders shut down, about when flights are cancelled and so on, or when quarantine protocols are put in place, could be really effective.
Thanks. I think I'm the only global health lawyer on this among the three of us, and a lot of the things that James and Beth have been discussing, were contemplated in the international health regulations. So after SARS, when there was a major reform of the international health regulations, one of the things that was put in place was a provision for independent verification of information of official state sources. But that didn't work with China because of its, relatively closed, non-transparent manners. But the IHR had a number of other key features that in terms of travel, human rights, that really seem to get lost in all of this. So, I'm going to just ask a couple of quick questions, and I'm going to go to audience questions. I wanted to, we talked about political clout for the WHO. You might want to continue to talk about that. That was one of Beth's interesting points. But there are two other things about China and global health that COVID has raised. One is the origins of the virus, and you've kind of got conspiracy theories on both sides. President Trump's been calling it the Wuhan virus against WHO advice, and China has, not too subtly supported the conspiracy theory that it was the United States military. So, talk a little bit about, the origin. Should we simply just accept the scientists who say that, we can't rule out anything, but the vast balance of probabilities is that this was naturally occurring and very possibly, very probably from the Wuhan wet market? Which one of you would like to jump in on that one?
I can comment very briefly on the, the question of the origin. I think the thing we have to recognize most of all is that it's an unsolvable question. And so we're always going to be defaulting to the most likely scenario, which is overwhelmingly what the scientists have proposed, that this was a natural jump from one species to another that took place in the context of wild animals in contact with humans. Probably not. We think at this point at the wet market itself, which seems to have been somewhat unfairly blamed. But in some context of increased human contact with wildlife that we've seen, of course, many times in South China, especially as deforestation produced more of these unexpected contacts. But why say it's not worth asking the question, or we can only accept that answer, is because we have to recognize that China at this point will never allow the kind of investigation that could produce a closer answer. Because if there was some other scenario, and I think the overwhelming evidence says that there wasn't, nobody would ever have the access, and nobody on the Chinese side would be able to give the honest answers that could lead to this. If somebody at the Wuhan Institute of Virology didn't wash their hands, which is really the worst case we're talking about, like a routine biosafety accident. So I think we just have to recognize it's not an answerable question and go with the best answer, but it would be very much in China's interest in the long run to be open about this, to allow this kind of access, to allow people in. But the nature of the Chinese political system at present is such that that is literally an impossibility.
Thank you.
Sorry, can I jump in really quickly?
Please do.
So, James, I agree that it's this is a super challenging question. And I agree with you, Larry, that the overwhelming evidence is that this is naturally a naturally occurring jump from bats or bats to pangolins to humans. And but I work on this for most of what I do is looking at how we can prevent future catastrophic biological events, including deliberate and accidental biological events. And one of the things this has really uncovered is that we don't have a regularized apolitical or relatively apolitical process to investigate the origin of a virus in the middle of a crisis, or the origin of a pathogen in the middle of a crisis. We only know what we can speculate in this case. And unfortunately, that's a problem, because it would be really helpful to know where it came from, both for purposes of whether and how it might reemerge in the future, even after we get to the point where we have therapeutics or vaccines. But also because if it was a laboratory accident, that would also be quite important to know. And it can't be ruled out categorically that it was a laboratory accident. I see no evidence to support it. But it is really important that we have a process for investigating viral origin. So right now we have the WHO public health investigation, and we have the UN Secretary General's mechanism for investigating deliberate chemical or biological events. If we don't have anything in between, and this is actually something that my organization at NTI, we're quite interested in trying to figure out and flesh out, what could something in the middle be like that would allow for experts to actually look into this issue in a way that allows the truth to be uncovered for public health purposes and for security purposes. Over.
Yeah, I mean, it's a great point, Beth, because, you know, many people might think that this is a purely academic question about whether or not where the origins were, but it tells us, if you're an epidemiologist or a virologist, it tells you a lot about what you need to know to develop countermeasures and to understand the epidemiology and transmission better. So these are not academic questions, and I think your idea of getting that kind of a mechanism is a really good one. I'm going to have a quick question for James from the audience, but then I want to come back to you, Beth, to talk about, you know, where in the world are we with science these days, with populist regimes, and science has been kind of the hidden underbelly of this problem. But for James, you know, many of us outside of China really find it hard to ascertain what the pandemic how it's viewed in China. Is the Chinese response perceived well, proficient within its borders? Has it had any ramifications for Chinese leadership within China and command of its, you know, population in terms of its population's willingness to be governed by Xi Jinping and the regime? Talk a little bit about that, and then I want to come to Beth on a little bit more on the science.
Well, I have to give that perpetually frustrating answer, which is that it's very hard for us to know, because gauging Chinese public opinion has always been difficult. It's become even more difficult since 2012, as we've seen the internet kind of internet freedom shut down, and these forums of speech that Chinese once had being closed down. But very loosely, what we can say, I think, is that there was a real sense of challenge and crisis in February, when particularly over the martyred doctor, and some of that bitterness still persists, particularly in Wuhan. There's a lot of questioning over, even at the ground level, in Wuhan in particular, there's a lot of questioning over official figures, because Chinese official figures are always a little bit shady, to say the least, particularly when it comes to death and disaster. And so there's a lot of talk about, you know, actually so many people died from like ordinary Chinese citizens. But I also think that more than anything else, not so much the strength of the Chinese response as the utter failure of the American response has massively strengthened the Chinese government's position. Because if you're Chinese now, you can say, well, you know, maybe the government didn't handle it well, and maybe, you know, and it was very annoying to be stuck inside for 2 months, and it's annoying to have to go through all this kind of checks and green lights and so on, and sometimes the system doesn't work, and my cousin had to pay a bribe to a guy to get past the gate and all this kind of thing, but we don't have 100,000 people dead. I think the comparison with the, more than anything else, being able to point at the US and say, look what it looks like when it fails, and to blame that in the Chinese case on democracy and on the US political system, has been an enormous boon for the regime.
Yeah, that's, I think that is true. Let me go back to Beth in terms of science, because one of the things that we've seen, you know, certainly in populist nations with strong leaders, you know, like, you know, Putin in Russia, or Trump in the United States, Bolsonaro in Brazil, we've seen an undermining of international institutions like the WHO and the UN, which you've eloquently talked about, Beth. But what about the role of science? You know, so say here in the United States, it looks like the White House task force on COVID has been somewhat sidelined. CDC has been weakened. And then you have this whole issue at WHO on, you know, asymptomatic transmission and universal mask wearing. So talk about, you know, the importance of science and what the threats and challenges that we face in following scientific evidence to get us a better answer to the COVID pandemic.
Yeah, well, it's obviously a huge question, Larry, and it's important both from the perspective of how the United States could have done a better job and can continue to do a better job in responding to the COVID-19 pandemic, but also how important our science diplomacy is in the race to the vaccine and in understanding how interventions in other countries could have helped us. So I'll just say a couple of quick things about both of those points. So one, in the United States, I think, when we were facing Ebola in West Africa, there was a huge gear up in our own response in the United States when we had cases here and globally. But it was a response that even at the White House level, which is obviously not, there's tons of scientific agencies, but even at the White House, we had a really strong Office of Science and Technology policy response that was actually putting together the big scientific questions that needed to be answered and rallying scientists from across the country to respond to those. And I think that's important because what we're seeing right now, at least what I'm seeing right now in COVID-19, is I'm seeing a ton of scientific work that's happening from the ground up. It's happening all over the country. It's happening all over the world. But in the United States, we're seeing that happen, but we're not seeing a pull from the federal government, with the exception of the vaccine development process. We're not seeing a pull about the different types of scientific questions that need to be answered, and a commensurate communication to the American people about the things we know and the things that we don't know on a regular basis. And so what I see is a bifurcation between what the government's doing on S&T and what academic institutions are doing and foundations are doing to build S&T in the middle of this crisis. And the link between them is tenuous. And we also then have a president who's undercutting science on a regular basis by saying things at press conferences that don't actually comport with the science. And then people like Tony Fauci or Deborah Birx have to come in behind him and, try to, clean it up. And I think what you end up with is a couple of big problems. One, I don't think that we're mustering our S&T workforce in the United States as effectively as we could, because we don't have sort of the whole of federal government and the whole of our scientific community rallied around very specific problems in a well-organized, nationally coordinated fashion. There's a lot of great work happening. It's not happening the way that it has happened in past crises that I was involved in in the last two administrations, actually. Two, we're seeing fact-based, science-based communication be garbled. And that leads an already confusing situation where we're learning new things about this virus on a daily or weekly basis. When you can't actually trust the messengers, that makes it even more confusing. Then you can't trust when they say, actually, we've learned something new and we should change our guidance. It's a self-fulfilling prophecy of confusion, I think, for the American public. The last thing I'll say is about global scientific diplomacy in the middle of a crisis and public health diplomacy, with epidemiologists included in the scientific bucket, obviously. I think that we could have done a lot more to understand what Germany was doing, what South Korea was doing, what New Zealand has been doing effectively. And when our scientists are talking to each other and informing the government response in an organized way, we have a much better chance of learning from what is actually working in other countries. And when you put us side by side with South Korea in terms of when we identified the first case and where we are now, there's a huge disconnect. And in fact, many of our public health professionals trained or co-trained or still co-train with CDC experts in South Korea. So it's really frustrating to watch the way that this is all unfolded and all of the missed opportunities. But it has emphasized for me the importance of a very well-organized S&T effort happening during a crisis with leadership from the top.
Well, thank you very much. We're actually at time. Forgive me, James, for trying to conclude now. But we've talked about some really important ideas. The United States-China relationship, and it being probably the most important international relationship there is today, and it will only grow in importance as those two countries take center stage. We've talked about how that relationship and the geopolitical competition between those two countries has affected, critical organizations like the World Health Organization, other UN agencies, and the UN itself, including the UN Security Council. And then we've talked about, really big problems that are facing the world now, for which we don't have really good solutions at the moment. Things like, how do we elevate science to kind of lead in a pandemic, and to create evidence-based solutions. And then, the Holy Grail, how are we going to cooperatively develop an effective vaccine and therapeutics, and then to make sure that it's equitably distributed to everyone in the world? Because I could think of no scenario that would be more damaging to international relationships, to think that a country like the United States or China or in Europe, that their people were pretty much protected. People were dying in their millions in Africa, Latin America, and elsewhere. So Beth and James, just a phenomenally informative conversation. I'm sorry to the audience. There were a lot of questions that were great that you sent, but we've run out of time. And we hope to do this again in the future for the O'Neill Institute. So from all of us, thank you very much for your participation, and just a really deep thanks to Beth and James. Take care.
Thank you, Larry.